Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
So we're diving into some really interesting recent developments. It looks like there might be a shift happening in how the conflict in Ukraine is being approached.
That's right, particularly involving U.S. President Trump, Russian President Putin, and, of course, the European allies. Their reactions are key here.
Absolutely. So our goal today is really just to unpack the main reported events and the different perspectives surrounding these potential changes. We're drawing on various news reports and analyses covering the international scene.
Okay, so where do we start? There was that meeting in Kiev, right, around May 10th.
Yeah, exactly. Reports suggest the UK, France, Germany, and Poland were there, and it seems they coordinated with the U.S. on a specific policy.
Right. They apparently gave Russian President Putin a kind of ultimatum. 48 hours, wasn't it?
That's what's reported. Agree to a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine or face a new wave of sanctions. Pretty direct.
And these weren't just any sanctions. We're talking potentially very high tariffs on Russian energy imports. The reports say U.S. President Trump and the European leaders were supposedly on board with this.
A big move, so hitting the energy sector hard. But, well, those sanctions didn't actually happen, did they?
No, they didn't. Apparently, the plan was put on hold because Russian President Putin came back with a counteroffer.
Which was?
Direct talks. He proposed direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to be held in Istanbul. Kind of echoes those earlier talks from 2022.
Interesting. And U.S. President Trump's reaction, he commented publicly, right?
He did, on Truth Social, reportedly. He urged Ukraine to agree to the Istanbul talks immediately. See if his deal was possible.
So pushing for diplomacy there, did Ukraine agree?
Yes, they did. They agreed to participate.
Okay, so talks in Istanbul, how did that go? Any breakthroughs?
Not really, no. The reports say the conference ended without any progress. Moscow apparently sent a, quote, second-level delegation.
Second level, so not the top decision makers.
Seems that way.
Yeah.
And they basically just reiterated their existing demands. Regime change in Kiev, full capitulation.
So no movement on their core position. Was that outcome surprising?
Well, given Russia's consistency on those points, maybe not entirely surprising, predictable, some might say.
Right. Familiar demands. Okay, let's shift to U.S. President Trump's actions. There was that phone call with Russian President Putin.
Yes, a significant event.
Oh.
A 2-hour conversation, reportedly. U.S. President Trump described it afterward as very good.
Very good. Did he elaborate on what that meant for the conflict?
Well, he reportedly expressed the view that fundamentally only the two sides directly involved, Russia and Ukraine, really understand the details needed to resolve things.
Suggesting maybe a more hands-off approach from the U.S. in the actual negotiation details?
Possibly.
Yeah.
It does imply a shift in how the U.S. might see its role. Okay. And there's more to it than just the negotiation process.
Oh, what else?
There are reports suggesting the U.S. is now actually planning a sort of rapprochement with Moscow.
A rapprochement? Really? With the focus on what?
Trade. That seems to be the key word.
Yeah.
The suggestion is that U.S. President Trump's priority might be shifting towards making money, towards economic opportunities.
So business interests possibly becoming more prominent than, say, the immediate goal of peace in Ukraine.
That's the implication in some analyses, yeah. A potential change in priorities.
And how are others reacting to this potential shift? Europe, for instance.
Well, there are reports, like in the New York Times, suggesting that European nations are slowly realizing that Washington's decisions might not dictate their agenda anymore. A delayed realization, perhaps.
A sense that the dynamics are changing, that maybe Europe needs to chart its own course more?
Exactly. And maybe a similar feeling is dawning in parts of the U.S. establishment, too. This evolving dynamic is definitely making waves.
So while the U.S. might be shifting focus, what's Europe doing? Are they still applying pressure on Russia?
Oh, absolutely. The EU, for example, just adopted its 17th package of sanctions.
17th? Wow. What's in this one?
This one targets about 200 ships, part of what's called the Shadow Russian Fleet. These are vessels reportedly used to get around the existing oil and gas sanctions.
So closing loopholes.
Yeah.
And the UK.
The UK is also active. They're apparently pushing for an 18th package targeting Russia's defense supply chain. Things like components for Iskander missiles, trying to hit their military production.
Seems like a continued effort to restrict Russia's war-making ability. Have there been any more direct incidents? Tensions seem high?
Yes, definitely. Things have gotten tense, particularly in the Baltic Sea. Estonia tried to intercept a Russian tanker, the Jaguar.
How did that end?
A Russian Su-35S fighter jet showed up and escorted the tanker, a clear show of force.
Wow. And that wasn't all, was it?
No, shortly after that, the Russian Navy reportedly stopped a Greek oil tanker, the Green Admire, after it left an Estonian port.
So tit-for-tat actions almost. It really highlights the risks in that region.
It does. And beyond these maritime incidents, there are other worrying reports about alleged Russian activities inside Europe.
What kind of activity?
We're talking about claims of increased GRU activity, that's Russia's military intelligence. An Associated Press study reportedly points to more sabotage, cyber attacks, even assassinations across Europe.
Sabotage? Like what?
Allegedly using agents recruited via Telegram for things like arson attacks, targeting shopping centers, warehouses, maybe even military sites. Also vandalism and plots to sabotage cargo planes in Germany, DHL aircraft. It's quite a list.
That sounds like a serious escalation of covert warfare, if true. Very concerning. Okay, let's bring it back to the U.S. perspective, specifically on sanctions and policy towards Ukraine. What's the view from Congress?
Well, Marco Rubio's statements to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee are interesting. He reportedly said that while the Trump administration made some concessions to Russia, the major sanctions weren't lifted.
So sanctions remained in place?
Broadly, yes. And crucially, he noted that arms supplies to Kiev continued, maybe with just a brief pause. He also stressed something important. Key sanctions, like those on banking and energy, need congressional approval to be lifted.
So the president can't just lift them unilaterally. Congress has a say.
Exactly. Which raises the question, would senators who backed those strong sanctions agree to let Russia back into the global financial system without a major deal on Ukraine, especially if Europe is still resisting that?
A significant hurdle. Is U.S. President Trump actually looking to increase sanctions, though?
Sources reportedly suggest he probably doesn't want to increase sanctions right now. And the Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. President Trump told Europeans that he thinks Russian President Putin isn't ready to stop fighting and believes he's already won, essentially.
He thinks Putin believes he's won. That's a stark assessment. It implies Putin has little incentive to negotiate seriously.
That seems to be the message conveyed, yes. It suggests a difficult path ahead for any peace efforts.
What about all the U.S. aid that's already been approved for Ukraine? Is that still flowing?
According to a publication by the Center for Strategic Studies, a lot of that previously approved aid is actually still in the pipeline, still being delivered.
But could that change?
There's a concern, yes. The possibility exists that U.S. President Trump might cancel those commitments, perhaps as a gesture to Russian President Putin, even without a ceasefire or a peace deal.
That would obviously be a massive blow to Ukraine's defense. Are there specific past decisions that could be reversed?
Oh, several. Think about the Patriot missile purchases from Israel for Ukraine, the certification for direct U.S. arms sales to Kiev, allowing allies to send F-16s and other systems.
Right, those are big steps.
Exactly. Reversing those would significantly weaken Ukraine's military position, and actively harming Ukraine would mean more than just stopping sales.
How so?
You'd potentially have to amend agreements to stop allies from reselling or transferring arms they already have.
That seems complicated. Do EU insiders think the U.S. will actually stop weapons flowing entirely?
There's skepticism, apparently. The view seems to be that as long as NATO allies, or Ukraine itself, can pay, the U.S. might not completely halt weapon supplies.
The economic argument again?
Partly. U.S. trade with its traditional allies is just vastly larger than its trade with Russia. That economic reality probably plays a role.
Makes sense. Meanwhile, is Europe stepping up its own defense production? We hear a lot about that.
They are, but it's slow going. They're trying to increase spending and procurement. But one interesting development is a potential collaboration between Germany's Rheinmetall and the U.S.'s Lockheed Martin.
What are they planning?
The idea is to potentially create a European competence center to produce advanced munitions. We're talking Attaxium, HIMARS rockets, Patriot missiles, the kind of things Ukraine desperately needs.
So building up European capacity to produce these key weapons, potentially for Ukraine, too.
That seems to be the expectation, yes. A long-term move towards more self-sufficiency.
Okay, let's shift focus back to the battlefield. What are the latest reports about Russian military actions? Any signs of new offensives?
There were reports, for example, in Bild suggesting Russia might be starting a new offensive. And the potential aim. Maybe 7 Ukrainian regions, not just the 4 they previously annexed.
7 regions. That's a major expansion of their stated goals. Where are they reportedly moving troops?
Towards Sumy, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk regions, in the northeast and east. Ukrainian military sources have apparently confirmed a buildup near the Sumy and Kharkiv borders.
A significant buildup. What about in the Donbass, in Donetsk?
Reports say Russian forces are still advancing there, getting closer to encircling Kostyantynivka, which is a key city.
So, continued pressure in the east. Is this after a pause?
Yes, apparently after a roughly 3-month lull in major ground offensives. Now there are reports of troop redeployments, more tanks and armored vehicles, stronger air power.
And have they adapted their tactics? We hear a lot about drone warfare.
The assessment seems to be yes. They've learned lessons and are reportedly deploying large numbers of new drones now. The fear is they might be targeting Ukrainian logistics more effectively.
And these drones aren't just hitting military targets.
No, tragically. There are reports alleging drones are being used deliberately to intimidate civilians, including an attack reported in Kiev.
A grim picture on the ground. How is all this U.S. shifting and Russian action playing out in European capitals? You mentioned frustration earlier.
Yes, reports describe outright rage among some European leaders about U.S. President Trump's apparent warming towards Russian President Putin, and a feeling of, well, powerlessness.
Powerlessness, that's strong.
There's even that dark joke reportedly going around among some U.S. diplomats about U.S. President Trump's promise to end the war in 24 hours.
What's the punchline?
Nobody knows when the 24 hours start. It really captures the uncertainty and, frankly, the anxiety.
Yeah, that speaks volumes. And despite that initial ultimatum threat, no new sanctions materialized after the Istanbul talks fizzled.
Correct, which adds to the anxiety. Then you have U.S. President Trump reportedly telling Europeans that Russian President Putin doesn't want peace or thinks he's winning, and that only Russia and Ukraine can set the terms for a truce.
Almost like washing his hands of it.
He even reportedly mentioned potentially stepping aside, leaving it mainly to Europe. That kind of talk naturally worries allies deeply.
But didn't the U.S. present a peace plan just before this? A 20-point plan.
Yes, that's the confusing part. Just prior to these comments, there was this reported 20-point U.S. plan presented to Europeans. And its first point was supposedly a full ceasefire.
So a detailed plan focused on ceasefire, followed by rhetoric suggesting stepping back. It's hard to know what the actual policy is.
Exactly. It creates a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
What should Europe do? How should they interpret this?
Is there any advice being offered? Maybe from former officials?
One perspective, reportedly from a former U.S. diplomat, is basically be patient with U.S. President Trump.
Patient. Why?
The argument is that his main goal is a ceasefire, and he understands Putin wants to keep fighting for now. So the strategy is tactical engagement with Moscow.
Tactical engagement how? Offering incentives.
Potentially. Things like maybe returning Russia to the G8, some sanctions relief, a summit. The idea, according to this view, is to achieve 4 things: ceasefire, reciprocity, preventing more Russian gains, and getting Europe to take the lead on de-escalation eventually.
So, a complex game focused ultimately on stopping the fighting. It does seem Washington and Kiev are more aligned on wanting a ceasefire now compared to before.
Marco Rubio's testimony kind of reflects that too. He reportedly said the core issue is Russia wanting what it shouldn't have, and Ukraine wanting back what it probably can't regain militarily right now. It paints a picture of a difficult stalemate.
So for Europe, regarding potential new U.S. sanctions on Russia, they just have to wait and see.
Pretty much. Their options seem limited on that front right now. Wait and see if U.S. President Trump acts on earlier threats.
Have there been high-level talks about this, say, between U.S. senators and EU officials?
Yes. Lindsey Graham reportedly talked with Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president. There's even speculation Congress might pass sanctions to help U.S. President Trump's negotiating hand, not to undermine him.
An interesting thought. But could threatening sanctions backfire?
That's the risk Marco Rubio reportedly warned about. Threatening sanctions might just make Russia shut down communication channels altogether. It's a delicate balance.
Definitely. What about Russia's version of the Trump-Putin call? How did they portray it?
Russian accounts reportedly stressed the warm, personal nature of the call. They mentioned U.S. President Trump praising Russia's WWII sacrifices, and apparently Russian President Putin proposed drafting a memorandum for a future peace agreement.
A memorandum?
Yeah.
It sounds like trying to lock something in. You can see why that would cause fear in Europe.
Absolutely. Fear that U.S. President Trump might distance the U.S. from the whole issue, with real potential consequences.
Like what? What are the specific fears?
Ending intelligence sharing with Ukraine, lifting sanctions unilaterally without consulting allies, or even canceling arms agreements with Kiev. Big, impactful steps.
Which could leave the EU holding the bag, essentially.
Potentially, yes. Making the EU the main security guarantor for Ukraine if the U.S. significantly steps back.
And there was that statement about a potential U.S. troop withdrawal from Europe altogether.
Yes. The new U.S. envoy to NATO reportedly said the Pentagon is planning a complete withdrawal after the June summit, though it's important to note many European officials are reportedly quite skeptical about that actually happening.
A complete withdrawal would be monumental. Even the threat must impact NATO planning.
Hugely. It raises serious questions about NATO's ability to agree on defense capabilities if the U.S. presence is uncertain.
And how does this sit with European NATO members who feel they've already committed to spending more on defense, partly due to U.S. pressure?
Reports suggest they're pretty disappointed, even frustrated. They feel they agreed to costly defense spending packages to address U.S. President Trump's criticisms about burden sharing, and now they face this uncertainty anyway.
It's understandable. What are leaders like Finland's President Stubbs saying about the bigger picture?
Alexander Stubbs' view, reportedly, is that Europeans need to grasp the U.S.'s current foreign policy focus: global competition. He compares U.S. President Trump's worldview to 19th century great power politics.
So, less about alliances, more about national interest and competition.
That seems to be his interpretation. And he argues Europeans need to convince the U.S. that things like free trade and common rules are better than just transactional deals. And importantly, that Europe itself is a security provider, not just a consumer.
How does he suggest convincing U.S. President Trump about Russia specifically?
By arguing Russia isn't really a great power anymore, economically or militarily. He points to its economy being smaller than Italy's or Spain's, its limited gains in Ukraine despite huge costs, and its depleted reserves. Basically, puncture the image of Russian strength.
An interesting counter-narrative. Does everyone agree? What about Poland's foreign minister?
Radosław Sikorski offers a different take, reportedly. He sees a united Europe as the future great power. He argues Putin has awoken a giant.
Awoken a giant? How so?
He points out European defense spending has doubled since U.S. President Trump came to power. He predicts Europe's economy will surpass Russia significantly by the end of the decade. His call is to optimize budgets based on lessons from Ukraine and turn that spending into real military power.
A more optimistic vision for Europe's own strength. But building that power takes time, right?
Yes, the estimate is at least 5 years for these major European developments to really bear fruit.
And in the meantime, what's the assessment for Ukraine?
The assessment seems to be that Ukraine, unfortunately, risks losing more territory in the near term. But on the other hand, Russia's own resources might eventually run low, making its military more reliant on potentially fragile international supply chains.
So a potential war of attrition. What's Ukraine's biggest challenge right now, according to these views?
Reportedly, it's not a lack of soldiers. It's about getting them adequately trained and, crucially, keeping them supplied with enough ammunition, logistics, and training.
Understood. So summing up the European mood,
Yeah.
still mostly despair and worry.
Largely, yes. Despair about U.S. President Trump's perceived unreliability, the potential withdrawal, and the prospect of the EU having to shoulder the main security burden for Ukraine.
You mentioned Kaja Kallas's comment.
Yes. The EU foreign policy chief reportedly said she's gone through the 5 stages of grief over transatlantic relations. And she used that analogy of trust being like a broken vase, hard, maybe impossible to fully repair.
It's a very bleak assessment of the relationship. Okay, finally, let's look at potential outcomes regarding territory. What are analysts like Oscar Krejci suggesting?
Krejci reportedly believes U.S. President Trump wants the war over, period, even if it means Ukraine conceding territory to Russia.
He thinks Trump would accept territorial concessions.
That's Krejci's reported view. He warns the Russian advance might be unstoppable currently, and Ukraine could lose more ground, possibly Kharkiv, maybe even Odessa.
Those would be devastating losses. How does he see President Zelensky's role in negotiations?
He reportedly views Zelensky as not being in a strong position, too reliant on Western support. Krejci also dismisses fears of Russia attacking the rest of Europe as complete nonsense, arguing their focus is limited to Ukraine.
What does Krejci think is driving the U.S. interest in a deal then, beyond just stopping the fighting?
He suggests potential U.S. economic interests, like maybe a deal on Ukraine's mineral resources. Also, a desire to shift U.S. focus away from Europe towards the Middle East, and especially China and the Pacific.
And he thinks Europe isn't grasping its changing place in the world.
Yeah, he reportedly feels Europe isn't recognizing its declining global influence compared to Asia's rise.
So how does Krejci interpret the Trump-Putin phone call in light of all this?
He reportedly sees it as a positive step, indicating U.S. President Trump is ready to broker an end to the war, accepting Russian territorial gains. He believes Trump has implicitly accepted Russia's control over Crimea and the newly occupied areas.
A very definitive and, for Ukraine, very concerning interpretation of events. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.